Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. I'm now going to give informal internet lessons about the end of the First World War and the events that followed the end of the First World War. As you probably know from reading history books, watching historical documentaries, reading historical uh, magazines, journals, and of course historical articles from newspapers, whether paper versions or online ones, and from your possible school studies. The First World War began, well, there are some different views on it. We can say that formally it began already on July the 28th, July the 28th, 1914, when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The immediate reason or pretext or excuse for starting the war was that Serbia had not approved all of the 10 points or demands, 10 or so demands that Austria-Hungary had made on it on July the 23rd, 1914. The response came from the Serbian government on July the 25th, and because the Serbian government did not want to infringe on its own sovereignty in the investigations demanded by Austria-Hungary concerning the assassination on June the 28th of the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, or Francis Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Because one of the demands had been about the Austro-Hungarian soldiers and police officers having a right to pursue and investigate the possible assassins or conspirators linked to the assassins who possibly were in the Serbian territory. The Serbian government had replied that such a demand could only be accepted within the confines of the international law, which, of course, as one of its strongest principles, gives every sovereign state, independent state, territorial integrity and sovereignty inside its own territory, and such a demand would definitely have compromised or limited Serbia's territorial sovereignty. By August the 1st, 1918, by August the 1st, 1914, we could say that the war had begun in the sense that, for example, Germany and Russia were already at war. And we could say that technically or practically Germany and France were at war. And the actual fighting, at least on the Western Front, began on August the 2nd, 1914, when German troops invaded Belgium and Luxembourg. They quickly occupied Luxembourg, and then during the course of the remainder of August and early September 1914, they conquered almost the entire Belgium. It became a truly world war or global war on August the 4th, 1914, when Britain, with its huge colonial empires, declared war on Germany. The expectation, or at least the hope, was that this war would end all wars. The British War Secretary or War Minister, Lord Kitchener, perhaps echoed quite many people's cautious hopes when he said that the war, or expectations, less than optimistic expectations, that the war would last for 3 years unless it was over in 3 months. Germany tried to crush France by a quick and solid and irresistible invasion of northeastern France. Its goal was to take Paris, as the Prussian or North German armies had had virtually managed to do in the French-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. They hadn't officially conquered Paris, but they had tightly surrounded it. But in 1914, despite the best of their efforts, the German armies stationed on the Western Front were unable even to encircle Paris. They did come within something like 70 kilometers of Paris. Nevertheless, they weren't really able to get closer. Despite the best of their efforts, the first battle of the Marne River in early September 1914 virtually ended their hopes of forcing a quick end to the war. On the Eastern Front, Germany did much better. In late August 1914, it was able to virtually destroy one of the invading Russian armies in East Prussia. And later in that autumn, although, technically that Battle of Tannenberg was still in the late summer, but later in the autumn of 1914, in the first Battle of the Masurian Lakes in what is now northeastern Poland, Germany also achieved a major victory and inflicted huge losses on the numerically strong but educationally and in their supplies weaker Russian forces. Nevertheless, Germany was unable to put the huge Russian armed forces out of action. And despite the great victories that Germany and its main ally Austria-Hungary scored against the Russians, they were only able to force the Russians, who by that time had already experienced two revolutions, the second one of which, the Bolshevik Revolution, would signal the rise of communist countries. Soviet Russia, or as it was called from December 1922 onwards, the Soviet Union became the world's first officially communist country, to be followed shortly thereafter by Mongolia in Eastern Asia. But anyway, the main Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, were only able to force the Soviet Russia into a peace treaty in Brest-Litovsk, or now Brest or Brest, in Belarus or White Russia, in March 1918. By that time, the German war morale was going down. Food shortages had started already probably in 1915 or 1916. The huge British Navy was able to blockade the North Sea effectively enough, and despite the fact that the German U-boats or submarines inflicted serious losses on the British Navy and then on many officially neutral ships and other vessels, they were unable to break that blockade. So we can say that also that North Sea blockade effectively meant that Germany could not win the war. Of course, in April 1917, when the United States had at last officially entered the war, one of the immediate causes, or maybe diplomatic excuses, had been the so-called Zimmermann telegraph. The German foreign minister had forwarded a telegram to the Mexican government promising Mexico 3 states in southern United States if Mexico should declare war on the United States, while Mexico in the event never did. But the military and economic arsenals or resources of the United States were so huge that especially once the shipping or transportation by ship, or ships rather, of US troops to Western Europe began in the summer of 1917. It was only a matter of time before the Allied or Entente powers in Western Europe would have such a large numerical and material superiority over the German forces that they would be able to force Germany out of France, out of Belgium, and then eventually be able to invade Germany proper. If Italy had remained on the side of the Central Powers, the history of the war might have been different. Italy had declared itself neutral back in August 1914, claiming that since the Central Powers military alliance was a defensive alliance and its government and army had not been consulted by the German and Austro-Hungarian political military authorities about the impending invasions of France and Serbia and Russia, it was appropriate for Italy to remain outside the war. Then there were strategic considerations. Italy, having its so-called boot shape, had and still has a very long coastline, and the British Navy sections or units in the Mediterranean Sea were so much more powerful than the Italian Navy that it didn't want to risk war against Britain there. Besides, Italy was dissatisfied with its northeastern border with Austria-Hungary, because outside the border but on the Austro-Hungarian side lived a sizable Italian minority. Austria-Hungary had refused, despite the two countries' technical military alliance with Germany, to revise the border in Italy's favor. Meanwhile, the Entente powers, mostly Britain's and France's diplomats, were making overtures to Italy, claiming that they would offer Italy a favorable deal should Italy agree to switch sides. And finally, in 1915, Italy did agree. However, Italy had a rather poor or mixed record in its many battles of the so-called Isonzo rivers battles in northeastern Italy against the Austro-Hungarian forces, although eventually when Austria-Hungary started to collapse in the fall of 1918, it did score significant victories. Romania in southeastern Europe was a much smaller country than it is today, and finally in August 1916 it ended its neutrality and entered the war on the Entente side. However, already by Christmas of that year, almost the entire country had been occupied, because the Romanian armed forces were simply too weak and poorly trained, or at least poorly armed. And the huge Russian armies were collapsing because of, for example, insufficient military training, insufficient supplies, and insufficient, or at least too widely varying level of armaments. Bulgaria had entered the war on the Central Powers side already in 1914, invading Serbia because it wanted to get back territories and because the Central Powers had promised it a re-access to the Adriatic Sea. Greece had eventually entered, by 1916, the Entente side, and then the so-called Salonika Front, named after the northern Greek city of Thessaloniki, was formed. And to put a long story short, in 1918 many decisive battles were fought in France, well, partly in Belgium, and then on the southeastern European front. With the result that the Bulgarian, and then we have to remember that the Ottoman Turkish Empire had also entered the war on the side of the Central Powers in 1914, and while it did achieve major victories against Russia, it eventually succumbed to the British invasions of, for example, Palestine, or now the modern Israel and the state of Palestine, in 1917. So 1918 was, after a fairly good start for the Central Powers, the favorable peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which then allowed Germany to transfer about 1 million soldiers to the Western Front. And after some initial successes in its spring offensives against France, or the United French, British, and American forces, had been forced to start retreating, and the so-called Black Day of German Army, August the 8th, 1918, showed that the German soldiers' fighting morale was weakening. Even Kaiser Wilhelm II, or in English, Emperor William II, the often sharply talking German emperor, had acknowledged that the German army had reached its limit of endurance. Germany did send troops to Finland during the country's brief but bloody civil war. They landed in southern Finland in April 1918, but by that time the Whites, or conservative and liberal troops, had already decisively defeated the Reds, or socialist and communist troops, especially in the Battle of Tampere, which had ended some or several days before the first German forces landed in Finland. Germany tried to further its interests in Finland and force more favorable peace terms in its upcoming peace negotiations, pointing out the fact that it had decisively defeated the huge Russian armies. However, given the fact that Germany was by October 1918 virtually alone, because even Austria-Hungary collapsed and the Ottoman Turkish Empire collapsed around the same time militarily, and besides, both empires started to break apart. And the Entente troops stationed on the Western Front had already entered Germany's westernmost regions, although the fairly quick signing of the Armistice on November the 11th, 1918, then gave the false impression that the German Western armies could still have fought for months. Well, perhaps technically they could have, but they would have had to do so without any remaining allies. With even the Austro-Hungarian armies out of action, and that huge Central and Southeastern European empire crumbling visibly, as it would be broken up into several countries or parts of countries after the First World War, Germany's military situation was hopeless. In October 1918, the liberal Prince Maximilian of the German state of Baden formed a government that relied on a parliamentary majority in the Reichstag, the German imperial parliament's lower house. And then one of the peace terms was Wilhelm II's abdication. At first, he and his closest supporters considered that demand a very arrogant one. However, by the first week of November 1918, Wilhelm II saw little reason to try to resist anymore, and thus he quietly departed Germany and exiled himself in Germany's northwestern neighbor, the Netherlands, where he lived until his death in 1941. The German Republic was then proclaimed by two social democratic politicians, one a radical politician who was allied with at least certain sections of the German Communist Party or movement. The other one was a mainstream or moderate social democratic politician who basically tried to save what could still be saved of the German territorial integrity and of Germany's national honor. Karl Liebknecht was the name of that radical social democratic politician, while Philipp Scheidemann was the name of that moderate to mainstream German social democratic politician. So, when the armistice was signed, over 4 years of warfare, especially in Europe, came to an end, although there had been battles related to the war also in Africa and Asia, mostly on those continents. Oceania, North America, and Latin America did not really see any major battles during the First World War compared to the Second World War, when Oceania was, because of the Pacific Ocean warfare between the United States and its major allies and Japan, one of the main theaters of the war. But anyway, when some 10 million soldiers and civilians died in the First World War and during its last months, the so-called influenza epidemic started to sweep through the world, and an estimated 20 million or so died in that epidemic. Many people were of the opinion that the world's political and military leaders should not allow another major war, another world war, to break out. No wonder pacifism became so popular in many Western democracies, especially in the 1920s. No wonder that in 1928, the so-called Kellogg-Briand Treaty, named after the United States Secretary of State and the French Foreign Minister, Frank Kellogg and Aristide Briand, officially declared that peaceful solutions should be found, if at all necessary, if at all possible, to the conflicts between different countries. But this sadly did not come into effect, as there were minor wars already earlier in the 1930s, before the official onset of the Second World War on September the 1st, 1939. Anyway, the armistice was signed in the forest of Compiègne in northeastern France. It came into force at 11 a.m. Paris time on November the 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And they marked a victory for the Entente powers or allies and a complete defeat for Germany, although Germany did not technically, officially surrender. The Allied Supreme Commander and French Marshal Ferdinand Foch largely prepared the terms of surrender. All fighting was to stop. The German forces were to withdraw behind the Rhine River. The British, American and French forces were to occupy the Rhineland and bridgeheads further east. Infrastructure such as roads and bridges were to be preserved. Germany was to surrender all of its military aircraft, warships, and other materials. The Allied or Entente prisoners of war and interned civilians were to be released, and Germany and the other Central Powers were to pay reparations to the Entente powers. However, there was no agreement on the release of German prisoners or relaxation of the naval blockade of Germany. This sparked the so-called German Revolution, which then included violence, especially in the Spartacist uprising in Berlin in early January 1919, which resulted in the deaths of many left-wing, especially communist activists, and among the victims were Mr. Karl Liebknecht and Miss Rosa Luxemburg, who was by birth a Polish Jew, by the way. Germany became a parliamentary democracy, and eventually, through the passage of the so-called Weimar Constitution, a semi-presidential but still also semi-parliamentary republic. For the first time in the German national history, the governments were to be responsible to the legislature, although at the federal level the Reich president had the right to dismiss governments, even if they had not lost the Reichstag's confidence, and had the right to dissolve the Reichstag according to his discretion without having to give an official reason for that, and in that case he always had to order early Reichstag elections. Besides, he had that notorious power to issue emergency decrees. Although there was one democratic safeguard, the Reichstag could at any moment by a simple majority nullify those decrees. However, between 1930 and 1933, the German Reich President Paul von Hindenburg opposed any such attempts by dissolving the Reichstag. But let's not get too far ahead. Anyway, in the negotiations on the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended the First World War on June the 28th, 1919, the German demands or requests were largely ignored. The German representatives were even humiliated by having to use a separate entrance to and exit from the Salle de Miroir, or Hall of Mirrors, of the Versailles Palace outside Paris in northeastern France. So in a procedural sense, as was pointed out by the late West German historian Mr. Detlef Peukert in his book The Weimar Republic, the Allies or Entente powers did impose a so-called diktat or dictated peace on Germany. The first post-World War I parliamentary elections in Germany that were held already in January 1919 showed that the parties most committed to a democratic and parliamentary republic, the Social Democrats, the centrists or Catholic centrists, because most of their active members and supporters were Catholics, and the Democrats or left-wing liberals had the support of over 3/4 of the participating voters. And accordingly, the Weimar Republic's constitution on the surface was quite a democratic model constitution, establishing a parliamentary, albeit semi-presidential, form of government, outlining many rights and freedoms, and even trying to secure, for example, economic rights in addition to the civil and political rights. But no mechanism was established by the Constitution to secure these rights, and during the Great Depression of the early 1930s, which hit countries like Germany so hard, these lofty-sounding phrases of the Constitution became largely dead letters. Even Marshal Foch actually is reported to have said, "We have won a truce of 20 years, and indeed it was about 20 years between the signing of the Versailles Treaty and the official outbreak of the Second World War in Europe. So Germany became for the first time in its history an officially democratic country. The Second German Empire that had been established in 1871 had been a partly dictatorial and authoritarian, even partly autocratic, and then a partly democratic regime. Because although the Second German Empire had appeared to be a democracy and a limited monarchy, in practice the Kaisers or emperor's powers were almost unlimited. Although contrary to the Russian Tsar or emperor, he did have to rule with a national legislature. And the national legislature's lower house, Reichstag, was elected by a fairly wide suffrage or right to vote. Most German male citizens aged 25 and older were able to vote in these federal parliamentary elections. However, given the fact that the Reichstag could not officially control the government because the emperor appointed and dismissed the imperial government's ministers, it could question them but not dismiss them. And given the fact that it had only a limited control over the German army's budget, because normally the Reichstag was elected for 3 years and the German army's budget was passed always for a 7-year term. And given the fact that the German Kaiser could at any moment dissolve the Reichstag and call early elections. All these factors then made the Reichstag's role, while still significant, it could introduce laws, but of course those laws could be vetoed not just by the emperor but also by the appointed upper house or Bundesrat, federal council, where the representatives of the most populous German federal state, the Kingdom of Prussia, Preußen, could collectively veto any measures they opposed. And Prussia contained over 60% of the German population during the Second Empire. No wonder that many conservative-minded Germans, even during the years of relative stability in the Weimar Republic from 1924 to 1929, harbored nostalgia for those good old days of the Second German Empire, when Germany, in their opinion, was much more honorable, much more powerful, and much more orderly and decent and moral country than it had become. They regarded the avant-gardist and modernist artistic and other movements, such as the Dadaists, as evidences of Germany's moral and spiritual decline. Many of them considered the German Jewish minority, although it barely comprised over 1% of the country's total population, as one of the reasons why Germany allegedly had lost the war. The so-called stab in the back myth was created by Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and or General Erich Ludendorff. They quoted, or one of them quoted, a British general who supposedly had said during an inquiry into the First World War that the German army had been stabbed in the back, when in reality, when the armistice started in November 1918, the German army or armies were on the verge of collapse, and Germany had lost all of its military allies by that time. But since, contrary to the Second World War, Germany still had not lost all of its territory. In fact, only a tiny western portion of the German territory was officially occupied by the Allies, contrary to the entire German territory being at least officially at the hands of Allies in early May 1945. Especially the conservative, nationalist-minded and patriotically minded Germans could claim that the country could still technically have resisted the Entente powers for some more months. But Germany's defeat was inevitable because it simply did not have enough soldiers, it did not have enough weapons, factories and so forth to stand against the hugely expanded Entente military and economic arsenals caused by the United States' entry into the war in April 1917. So, the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. There was the question of war guilt, and Germany was, somewhat inaccurately and unfairly, declared as the country that was guilty of starting the First World War. However, we must remember that it was Austria-Hungary who first declared war on an Entente or Entente-affiliated country, Serbia, on July the 28th, 1914. A few days before, Germany declared war first on Russia and then on France, and then eventually, of course, Germany countered the British declaration of war by declaring war on it. So Austria-Hungary was also guilty of starting the First World War because it wanted to crush Serbia and prevent the emergence of a greater Serbia, but was unsuccessful because the kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, officially Yugoslavia from 1929 to 1991 or so, when it effectively broke down, was created after the First World War. Then there were the huge war reparations payments on Germany. Then the Rhineland was to be occupied, although in practice only British and especially French troops occupied it because of the United States' isolationist stance for over 10 years after the First World War. The state of Poland, which had been partitioned off the map of Eastern Europe in the late 18th century, was to be recreated with access to the sea, the so-called Polish corridor, on a tiny portion of the Baltic Sea's southern coast. The principle of national self-determination was to be followed. Germany was to recognize the complete independence of Austria, many of whose German-speaking inhabitants actually had wanted to join Germany because the Austro-Hungarian Empire had broken down, and of Czechoslovakia. Germany lost territories in Europe, the Alsace and Lorraine provinces, or Elsass and Lothringen, to France, then a tiny territory to Belgium, upon Malmedy, a small territory on the Jutland Peninsula to Denmark, and then parts of Pomerania and East Prussia to Poland to create the so-called Polish corridor. also parts of Upper Silesia to Poland. Germany also lost all of its colonies to the Entente powers, in practice to Britain. In 1921, the total cost of the German war reparations payments was assessed at 132 billion German marks, roughly equivalent to 442 billion US dollars or 284 billion British pounds in 2018. So a huge sum of money. And I'm not sure if Germany ever was able to repay it in full before the onset of the Second World War. At the time, economists, notably that famous British supply and demand oriented economist John Maynard Keynes, predicted that the treaty was too harsh, a Carthaginian peace, and said that the reparations figure was excessive and counterproductive. And later history has largely validated these proofs, because these were among the major slogans and excuses of National Socialists or Nazis and their right-wing and far-right allies to oppose the entire peace treaty and then to support the German rearmament, which began shortly after Hitler had seized power in Germany in 1933. While Marshal Foch said that they had won a 20-year truce, he also criticized the treaty for treating Germany too leniently, and he was joined in that criticism especially by the anti-German French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau. The idealistic and deeply committed Christian, more specifically Presbyterian President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, wanted a moderate peace. Clemenceau mocked him for thinking supposedly that he was another Jesus Christ who had come to the earth to change people. While the third one of the big three, the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, was somewhere between these two extremes. The Italian Foreign Minister Vittorio Orlando was counted among the big four, but in practice he did not influence their decisions much. Then there was the term that in especially Asia, so-called self-governing mandates or mandate territories were to be established to prepare former British and French colonies or then current British and French colonies for full independence in the future. Several new states were created in Europe. If we start from the north, Finland, it had declared its independence, however, already in December 1917. Then the three Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Poland was re-established in Eastern, Central, and Eastern Europe. Czechoslovakia was established in Eastern, Central Europe. Austria and Hungary were all that remained officially of the huge Austro-Hungarian empire, and even they were separate countries. Yugoslavia, or officially the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, was established. Yes, that was it. The Ottoman Turkish Empire broke up. Turkey had to surrender large territories in Western Asia or the Middle East, also some in Yeah. Yeah, possibly it had already lost its possessions in North Africa, yes. And then Turkey's territory was uh, restricted largely to Asia Minor in Western Asia, and Turkey became a republic under its authoritarian or autocratic leader, Mr. Kemal Atatürk, in 1923. Yeah, plebiscites were held in certain disputed territories. Um, for example, in southern Austria, in Klagenfurt or Kärnten, Carinthia, and Burgenland. Then in East Prussia, Allenstein, in Upper Silesia, and so forth. Yeah, there were a few mandate countries also in Africa. Yes, and in New Zealand. Then Germany was to have 100,000 soldier strong defensive army. It was forbidden to have any fighting aircraft, any gas weapons to be used for fighting, and there were to be a maximum of 7 infantry and 3 cavalry decisions. And there was to be no universal military service or conscription. Then the Rhineland was to be demilitarized. All fortifications in the Rhineland and 50 kilometers east of the river were to be demolished, and new construction was forbidden. The German army was also limited drastically to a maximum of 6 light cruisers, 12 destroyers, and 12 torpedo boats, and submarines were forbidden. Then the League of Nations was established. That was the brainchild of President Woodrow Wilson. Then the International Labour Officer or organization. But already in 1922, as a secret corollary to the Treaty of Rapallo, Germany and the Soviet Union started to conduct secret military exercises in the Soviet Union. And then by 1935, the German rearmament was in full bloom. Italy was quite disappointed in that it only received a slight territory in the so-called Istrian Peninsula from the collapsed Austro-Hungarian Empire. So overall, this treaty, while it was well-meaning, it contained largely the seeds of another war, because especially many Germans felt humiliated by the treaty. Quite many Italians were dissatisfied with it as well. And of course, in the Soviet Russia, or soon to be renamed the Soviet Union, there were many who wanted to see the Soviet Union expand to the Tsarist times borders, which were clearly more westward ones, and to recapture those countries that had been either partly or totally under the Russian rule. So Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland. And then, of course, there were those communists who wanted to capture the entire Europe, and then as many other countries of the world as were necessary to establish the Soviet Union as the world's most powerful country. And then Germany had similar goals, and then these overlapped not just with the Soviet ones, but even partly with the Italian ones in North Africa and in the Mediterranean region. So thank you for listening. Good night.